So I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Pilger.
Great, thank you. So good to be here. And thank you for the invitation to be here to speak, and especially to my friend Anthony Arnove. I'm delighted especially to be here on the 4th of July. Which is an appropriate day to talk about Empire, Obama, and America's Last Taboo. I'm sorry that title's a bit wordy, but I couldn't get it down to something as it should be. Now, 2 years ago, I spoke at Socialism in Chicago about an invisible government, which is a term used by Edward Bernays, one of the founders of modern propaganda. It was Bernays who, in the 1920s, invented public relations as a euphemism for propaganda. And it was Bernays, deploying the ideas of his uncle, Sigmund Freud, who campaigned on behalf of the tobacco industry for women to take up smoking as an act of feminist liberation, calling cigarettes torches of freedom. At the same time, he was involved in the disinformation that was critical in overthrowing the Arbenz government in Guatemala. So you have the association there of cigarettes and regime change. The invisible government that Bernays had in mind brought together all media, PR, the press, broadcasting, advertising, and their power of branding and image making. In other words, disinformation. And I suppose I'd like to talk today about this invisible government's most recent achievement, the rise of Barack Obama and the silencing of much of the left. But all of this has a history, of course, and I'd like to go back, take you back some 40 years to a sultry and, for me, very memorable day in Vietnam. I was a young war correspondent who had just arrived in a village in the Central Highlands called Tuy Loan. My assignment was to write about a unit of US Marines who had been sent to the village to win hearts and minds. My orders, said the Marine Sergeant, are to sell the American way of liberty as stated in the Pacification Handbook. This is designed to win the hearts and minds of folks as stated on page 86. Page 86 was headed in capital letters, WHAM, winning hearts and minds. The Marine unit was a combined action company, which, explained the sergeant, meant, and I quote, we attack these folks on Mondays and we win their hearts and minds on Tuesdays, unquote. He was joking, of course, but not quite. The sergeant, who didn't speak Vietnamese, had arrived in the village, stood up in a jeep, and said through a bullhorn, come on out, everybody, we got rice and candies and toothbrushes to give you. This was greeted by silence. Now listen, either you gooks come on out or we're going to come right in there and get you. Now the people of Tuy Loan finally came out and they stood in line to receive packets of Uncle Ben's Miracle Rice, Hershey bars, party balloons, and several thousand toothbrushes. 3 portable battery-operated yellow flush lavatories were held back for the arrival of the colonel. And when the colonel arrived that evening, the district chief was summoned and the yellow flush lavatories unveiled. The colonel cleared his throat and took out a handwritten speech. Mr. District Chief, and all you nice people, said the Colonel, what these gifts represent is more than the sum of their parts. They carry the spirit of America. I promise you I'm quoting verbatim. Ladies and gentlemen, there's no place on earth like America. It's the land where miracles happen. It's a guiding light for me and for you. In America, you see, we count ourselves as real lucky, as having the greatest democracy the world has ever known, and we want you nice people to share in our good fortune. Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, even John Winthrop's city upon a hill got a mention. All that was missing was the Star-Spangled Banner playing softly in the background. Of course, the villagers had no idea what the Colonel was talking about, but when the Marines clapped, they clapped, and when the Colonel waved, the children waved. And when he departed, the Colonel shook the sergeant's hands and said, "We've got plenty of hearts and minds here. Carry on, Sergeant." Yes, sir. In Vietnam, I witnessed many scenes like that. I'd grown up in faraway Australia on a cinematic diet of John Wayne, Randolph Scott, Walt Disney and Ronald Reagan. The American way of liberty they portrayed might well have been lifted from the Wham handbook. I'd learned that the United States had won World War II on its own and now led the free world as the chosen society. It was only later when I read Walter Lippmann's book, Public Opinion, a manual of the invisible government, that I began to understand the power of emotions attached to false ideas and bad histories on a grand scale. Now, historians call this exceptionalism, the notion that the United States has a divine right to bring what it calls liberty to the rest of humanity. Of course, this is a very old refrain. The French and British created and celebrated their own civilizing missions while imposing colonial regimes that denied basic civil liberties. However, the power of the American message was and remains different. Whereas the Europeans were proud imperialists, Americans are trained to deny their imperialism. As Mexico was conquered and the Marines sent to Nicaragua, American textbooks referred to an age of innocence. American motives were always well-meaning, moral, exceptional. As the Colonel said, there was no ideology, they said, and that's still the case. Americanism is an ideology that is unique because its main feature is its denial that it is an ideology. It's both conservative and it's liberal, and it's right and it's left. And Barack Obama is its embodiment. Since Obama was elected, leading liberals have talked about America returning to its true status as, and I quote, a nation of moral ideals. Those are the words of Paul Krugman,